τελευταίος ομιλητής είναι ο Philippe Carteron de Balmont.
Philippe Carteron de Balmont. He's a general manager and the founder for CarthaGenetics consulting company, founded in 2004, seated in Switzerland and specializing in orphan drugs. They negotiate with the authorities, advocacy groups, find patients for clinical studies, authorization procedures. He has worked at the high posts in orphan drug companies. He has a master in biology and pharmaceutical marketing and executive master in international negotiations and policy making. He has participated in development of a strategy for orphan drugs in Turkey. He shall talk about benchmarking procedures for orphan drugs.
Thank you very much for this introduction, even if I've not understood everything, of course. I've been a bit astonished when I've been asked to speak about regulatory affairs in Europe, because I'm not a pharmacist, so I would like to have all your mercy about my presentation, because it has been done by some members of my team. And I'm not a pharmacist, I'm a biologist, so I'm more concrete and I'm not into legal things. We will have a journey into the orphan drug area, and I will try to be as quick as possible because we don't have a lot of time. I will just redefine what is a rare disease, what is an orphan drug, a brief overview about early access, and what is, I would say, some important step into the marketing approval step, including, I would say, some action with the CHMP. And I will hand with question and answer and thinking about the future at this moment. So just to give you some vocab first, and I will reuse that for early access, just to be sure that we are speaking about orphan drug, we are speaking about rare disease, orphan disease, so to be clear that rare disease are rare, orphan drug are a status which is given by some countries, which affects usually in Europe, which has been decided, it's 1 in 2,000 citizens. There are about 7,000 rare disorders, and we all have somebody in our closest friends or even in our family affected by a rare disease. You just have to think about 10 people in the we say closest circle around you, and one of them is affected by a rare disease. Think about that because it's extremely important. 80% of these rare disorders are genetic disorders, and the time of onset can be very variable, but most of them are genetic disorders which appearing at birth and affecting children, and that will be important in the PIP, which has been developed in 2006 for forcing companies to have a clinical trial for children, and it gives for orphan drugs, for instance, 2-year extra exclusivity, which is not neglectable. Just to think that we have about 30 million people affected in Europe with a rare disorder, so it's extremely important to think about that. And as I said, for the moment, there are not so many treatable diseases, about 7,000 rare disorders, and we have about 100 treatments, more or less, approved or not approved. Just to have a very long story, very short, I would say that the Orphan Drug Act occurred in the US in 1983. And it was giving exclusivity and some tax exemptions to some companies who were investing into the orphan drug area. It has taken almost 2 decades for Europe to reach that level, because we had the orphan drug, the European legislation in 2000 effectively, and which has been developed. In the meantime, I would say smaller countries than Europe, like Singapore or Japan, has set up their own orphan drug legislation. So it has been, I would say, a series of different regulations, starting in 2000 with the orphan regulation, and it has been improved by different scientific, I would say not scientific, different regulation to increase the help into this this legislation, and for instance with the PIP to force companies to have a clinical trial on children. I would like to really emphasize on one thing, that regulatory path for orphan drug is not different that from the other drugs, and that is extremely important. We don't have a cheap marketing approval in Europe for orphan drug, and this is really good, I would say. And it happened in some companies I've been in contact with. They are thinking that about treating a horse, for instance, they were able to go directly on clinical and to have early access in some European countries. So we have to be very clear. We need to go through, I would say, normal phase 1, 2, 3. It could be /2, 3, but it's not a cheap marketing approval. During this regulation, there are some, I would say, some specific things for orphans, which is the submission for the orphan drug designation, which has to be done as soon as possible. And it gives also for companies, I would say, like patent, I would say some value for having more, I would say, investors. When you have an orphan drug designation for your product candidate, of course you have something, because it will give you the 10-year exclusivity if your clinical trial are successful. You have also some assistance in the protocol, and that is extremely important also for developing, because in the rare disorders you have some very, I would say the eligible patients for clinical trial are very, very limited. Think that the population is at the beginning very small, and then you have to find usually patients who are affected but not too much affected, and not affected at all, to be able to show an effect in a very, very short period of time. This is the goal of the company, and that's why usually my customers, who are mainly American companies, are coming to Europe. They are looking for patients because they don't have enough eligible patients in the US, and because my company is also located in the south part of Mediterranean, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Turkey, where consanguinity is higher, we have more chance to find some patients and then more eligible patients. So I would say that beside that beside this protocol assistant, there is nothing special. I would say the clinical trial has to go on as a normal one, except that of course the number of patients will be extremely limited. I will take the example, for instance, for CarthaGenetics on MPS 7, the phase 3 was about 3 patients, and the phase 2, sorry, was about 3 patients, and the phase 3 was about 12 patients. So it's very limited number of patients, but we have to be able to show an effect. As I said, the orphan drug designation, so they have given some criteria. It's important to also to keep in mind that the European orphan drug designation is not a copy and paste from the American one. Some American companies are thinking, oh, it's very easy, we had it in the US, we want to have it in Europe, it's just a copy and paste. No, you have to reshape all the dossier, and you have to show that in each member state you are not exceeding the authorized prevalence. This is extremely important. Usually they are giving an answer in 90 days, so you have to fix, there are some fixed date where you can make the application. There is a first meeting when you have to go into detail with them. The clock stops, and then you restart. As I said, the most important thing in ODD is the market exclusivity for 10 years, on the opposite in the US, where it's 7 years only. And you also have the scientific advice and the protocol assistance for your clinical trial design. And you can also be part of a clinical trial funding through Horizon 2020. So just to show how it has stimulated the orphan drug development, there have been almost 2,000 orphan drug designations during the last 2 decades, and there was in 2016 128 marketing approval for orphan drugs. So it has really increased the research and the variety, and most of these orphan drugs are for pediatric use. So that's important, and we will go to the PIP immediately. So the PIP has been developed in 2016, and it's forcing companies to make clinical trial in children, and which I would say for most of the orphan drugs, it's clearly you have to have children involved because 80%, 60% are pediatric diseases. But anyhow, it's really gives some more results because it's really to show from the very beginning, if we treat somebody, what will happen in the future. You can submit the PIP anytime when you want, during the phase 1 or before the phase 3, that's for sure. And it's a 100-day procedure, and it's binding the company. So you are really, when you have the PIP designation, you really have to do your clinical trial in the way it has been, I would say, decided by the committee. PIP is mandatory for new product, and I would say the key point for companies is that it gives 2 more years exclusivity. So in total, you can reach 12 years of exclusivity for an orphan drug, which is not neglectable at all. I will go now on the early access for orphan drug, which is also a way which is, I would say, not common for, I would say, normal drugs, because in some countries in Europe, and we will not go into details because we are short in time, in 20 minutes I have to speak very quickly, and I apologize for that, because being a Swiss citizen, we are used to speak very, very slowly. But I will be available during the dinner in the afternoon if you want to have more detail about a specific country. So just to reduce some vocab, as I did at the very beginning, we have to be clear about what we are saying. I would say named patient sales are product candidates which are sold before marketing approval, while compassionate use is free of charge, or drug can be given for humanitarian reasons, or it can be given during a phase 3 or phase 2 extension. So I would say the early access programs are I would say the addition of the named patient sales and the compassionate use. You always emphasizing on this vocab, because for American companies, compassionate use could be paid, like it could be also in Spain, for instance. So to be sure that we are speaking the same language. So the precondition to have an early access program or named patient sales, it has to be for a rare or a serious disease. So you have to have really a hope to save the life of an important organ of the patient. There should be no satisfactory method. And you can enter in some country with phase 2 data. This is extremely important. You should have, I would say, all safety data done. It's out of question to treat with a drug candidate which is not safe at all. And you should have hope, I would say, of a benefit for a patient. And of course, it doesn't replace any clinical trial. So it's more an addition. If you don't have, for instance, if you take the example of a country which is quite defined for early access, like France, if you have a clinical trial going on in France, of course, if the patient, if eligible, the patient will go on clinical trial. If for some reason the patient is not eligible from the criteria of the clinical trial, then the patient might be considered for an early access through the ATU system. So I would say that it's really different paths. There is the normal way, which I consider like the highway when the product is registered and locally reimbursed. And you have, I would say, the little path in the forest or the local road, which is the early access program, where the product is not approved in Europe, but reimbursement is sometime in some countries possible. And I think with the early access program, the marketing authorization and the clinical trial, you have to make a product candidate accessible for some patients. So just to have an historical background, the early access program have been set up by the French in the 80s during the start of the HIV epidemic. At that time, it was more or less considered as a rare disorder, and under the pressure of the patient group, the French government has set up the ATU system to answer to the questions and to the demand of the patient groups. After that, it has been spread in some different countries, and you will see that later on the map, which are the countries which are accessible to reach the patient as soon as you have a hope for this patient, and when, of course, when you have efficacy, safety data. So the general requirement, as I said, efficacy has to be presumed and safety has to be demonstrated, and you can go with phase 2 data in some country. You have to have some publications, official publication. It could be through just an abstract during a meeting, a congress. You have to have a PV set up on a European basis, and you have to organize the logistic, but usually you are just delivering the French, the Italian, or Turkey directly, and it can go directly from your country or from the US directly to the local hospitals. And what is extremely important during all these early access program, marketing and promotion are strictly forbidden. So it is out of question to put 1,000 of sales rep in the field and to convince physicians. This is absolutely not the way. You can only work with reprints of scientific articles, and that's all. And you can speak face-to-face with physician patient groups. There are a lot of advantage to set up early access program, because then you can provide ethically a product candidate before EMEA approval or Swissmedic or TGK if it's in Turkey. You have also access to health authority, because of course you will discuss with them. What they will hate is really to receive just an application from a physician and saying we want this product. The sooner you go to meet them, the better it is. You will increase the awareness among the scientific community, and also you will increase the awareness of your company among the pharma industry. And sometimes it happens to me that some of my customers where we have been quite successful, then Pfizer came and bought the company. So it could be good for the company. I had to work another 2 years for Pfizer because my contract was not so good, and it was a bit complicated when you are used to work with, I would say, small companies and startup where the decision making is done in 2 hours. When you have to go in a big pharma, it takes days or weeks before having any answer. And last but not least, which is extremely important, is that in some European country, reimbursement can take 1 or 2 years. And if you don't have named patient sales before, it's extremely difficult or quite impossible to have sales during this period. And if you are losing 2 years in a 10-year exclusivity, it can be a lot of money. So I always advising my customers to go on named patient sales wherever they can as soon as possible, to be sure that they can go on with named patient sales during the reimbursement process taking place in each member state. And of course, it will give you some revenues. So I will discuss briefly, I don't have a specific slide about pricing and reimbursement during the named patient sales phase. Usually there are very little price negotiation, and it's extremely important for your companies to have clearly in mind what is the targeted price, because the French ATU, for instance, or the Law 648 in Italy will be your first price, and it's not public, but it's very, very easy to find what is the price. And after that, when you will have this first price, which are more or less public, it will be extremely difficult for you to increase your price during the price negotiation afterwards. So it's better to go higher and to decrease and to have room for negotiation than the opposite, of course. What is the importance? So named patient sales are an exception, they are not the rule, and we have to keep in mind a very important fact, that named patient sales have been made for patients who cannot wait for the European approval. This is really clearly the point that you have to keep in mind. It's the go home, the home taking message that you have to keep in mind. It's only for patients who cannot wait. If patient can wait another 2 years, it's out of question to go on named patient sales. So it's for really when you will potentially could save an organ or save the life of the patient. As I said, it's useless to have thousands of sales reps in the field, and I'm always using that multiplying the numbers of mothers doesn't decrease the pregnancy time, and this is really important. And you always have to be very transparent with health authority to visit them as soon as possible and to say, and because they have to budget these things, if you come and you say, well, by the way, I have a treatment, I have to treat 3,000 patients and the cost of the drug is 500,000 per year, they will wait for you with gun, I can tell you. And they are perfectly right. So it's better to visit them as soon as possible, say that this is what we are doing at this moment. We have a phase 2 ongoing, and we might have a product candidate in the future. We might have some application in the future, and this is the prevalence that we are expecting. The sooner you take contact with them, the better it is. So I will not go into detail of the map, it's just to give you an idea which are the countries where you can go with early access programs paid one. I will focus mainly on the blue country where you can enter with phase 2 data. So it's mainly France and Italy. Finland, but there are more mosquito than inhabitants in Finland, so it's not, I would say, a huge market, and to a certain extent Switzerland. But I would say that the key point in these countries where you are social security, it's always easier than with countries with private insurances where you have to discuss with each private insurance of each patient. Till recently, Turkey was also part of the blue country. Unfortunately, after the crisis, I would say they closed a little bit the door for early access program. However, it's one again you have to discuss with health authorities, and I've been able to convince Turkish health authorities that the French ATU was a kind of peak approval what they are requiring for giving early access to their citizens. So it's just a question of discussion, and this map is valid today, but it could change from one day to another. So it's not, don't consider that as the carved in the stone, because it's not the case anymore. And then you have countries where you have to be approved in other countries. So mainly it's in Germany, in the UK, and you have to be approved also if you want to enter into Algeria, for instance. And some other countries you can discuss while between the phase 3 data or CHMP approval and the official marketing approval. The marketing authorization is absolutely the same as I would say for all drugs. There is nothing specific about marketing authorization, except that you can have some conditional approval, meaning that you can treat, but you have to demonstrate further that your results are robust and they are lasting in time. This is the most important. This is the conditional approval. There is something which is also important for the market approval in Europe. So if you remember, the CHMP is with 36 votes for 30 countries, EU plus Norway plus Iceland. And you have to keep in mind that it's a UN system with a one country, one vote. This is extremely important. And some countries do not have the human resources to read all the paper and all the documents that they are receiving, and they are sometimes voting as their neighbor. Keep in mind that there are more small countries in the east than only the big five in the west. So if you want to reach, I would say, the majority, it's very important for companies to take contact with the local KOLs, the local patient groups, to be sure that the CHMP representative will read the paper and has its own opinion or her own opinion. I think, as I said, globally, the rare disease and the orphan drug legislation has proven that there have been some result with, I would say, a lot of drugs which have been approved. There have been a lot of countries which have adopted national plans for rare disorders. They have more and more collaboration. So I think the things are going in the right direction. But, and there is always a but, I think high prices are not sustainable, and we have all heard about the Biogen Spinraza, and I was remembering a congress in Turkey when they say if they treat all the patients with SMA with Spinraza, it will cost their whole budget of imported drugs. So it's a big question mark. Early access is becoming more and more difficult. You have difficulties to get reimbursed in some Eastern countries, and I would say not the smallest one and not the poorest one. I think about Poland, for instance, which access to orphan drug is extremely difficult. And you have also, I would say now, the shift to the gene therapies or advanced therapies. We will change totally the picture. There will not be early access or late access. There will be access, yes or no. There will not be a need anymore of sales reps or things like that, because the patient will be treated once and that's enough. And there will be more and more in the future, I would say, and we had the case from Strimvelis, for instance, that patients will cross the border to be treated in an expert center because it seems absolutely out of question to set up in every member state some specific center. You cannot have a specific center in Malta or in South Cyprus or in small countries like Estonia. So it means that in the future, I would say government have to discuss how they will get reimbursed each other by sending patients cross borders. I think this is the key point. I would like to thank the organizer. I would like to thank specifically Mrs. Annie Wolf, Dr. Ségolène Aimé, and Yann Lecam, who has established all the legislation for orphan drugs during I would say the 90s until it has been set up. I would like to thank some physicians I worked with during the past years, the patient groups, and I would like a specific thanks to Dr. Akbulat in Turkey, Dr. Ben Mansour in Algeria, and Christine Lavery, who passed away last year and who dedicate their life to orphan diseases. Thank you very much.
Thank you.